Sorry, everybody. Okay,
Yes, yeah, perfect.
thank you. So if everybody could be mute themselves, please, that would be very helpful. It's become evident, you will see, we're going to record today. So for tonight's session, for those who have just come in, we're just going to be recording Ros's session. There'll be time later for sharing provided, but we won't be recording that. So we're wanting to protect people's privacy. So if you haven't already, if you could put your view onto speaker side by side, and you'll find that up in the view section there on your computer. So you should just be able to see Ros and myself, and I hope that's what you're seeing at the moment. Okay, terrific. Thanks, Leon. So my name is Jacinta Bright, and I'm Pastoral Associate at St Mary's at Greensborough, and I welcome you all to this session, the whole story of mental health, the whole story of mental health. And I just want to give you a little bit of background as to where it's come from, and then introduce Ros to you. In 2018, in parishes around Australia, small groups gathered to listen deeply to one another's stories of faith in order to discern our responses to the Plenary Council 2020. The themes we were considering came from the question that the bishops asked us: how is God calling us to be a Christ-centred church in Australia that is missionary and evangelising, inclusive, participatory and synodal, prayerful and Eucharistic, humble, healing and merciful, a joyful, hope-filled servant community, and open to conversion, renewal and reform? For the 60 plus people at St Mary's who gathered to discern, one key theme emerged over and over again, and that was the hope for, the desire for a growing and understanding, inclusive, healing, hope-filled church in consideration of and with those living with mental ill health. Last year began the journey of a group that was established in the parish to find ways to respond to this great desire. This group calls itself LAMP, which stands for Love and Mental Peace. This evening is one initiative created by the LAMP group. Ros Cairns is a member of our group. Ros is a sister of the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart and a parishioner of St Mary's. When I placed a notice in our newsletter calling for interested people for the group, I so hoped Ros would respond, and she did. Ros has a long history in the field of mental ill health, as you would have seen on the flyer. More recently, Ros lectures in spirituality and mental health with the University of Divinity at Stirling College. Ros's experience and skill set is underpinned by what we have come to see as a deep insight and wisdom, shaped in her through her embrace of vulnerability. Ros doesn't come to us with theory and evidence-based practice alone. Ros is a deep listener to others and to the stirrings in her own heart. Ros comes to us as one who is integrated as a person and who therefore can lead us to reflect on the whole story of mental health, because Ros comes herself from a place of wholeness. So let us sit back now and listen deeply to what Ros has to share with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jacinta. That was such an introduction. I thank you very much for it, and I feel very humbled by it. What I feel I'm going to do tonight is probably a little bit more like a tasting plate, because it really is only an introduction to begin to look at the whole area of mental health from a slightly different perspective than what some of us might be used to. The name of the group that emerged from the parish was LAMP. And as you can see from on this slide, it's Loving Acceptance for Mental Peace. In the whole area of mental health, I believe that there are two very vital factors that we need to keep in consideration for both our understanding of this area and also what involvement or connections we might be able to make in this area. And whether that's family member to family member, in the workspace, your parish community, neighbour to neighbour, friend to friend, or simply the person we meet in the street. And also to be aware of the challenges that seem to emerge in this area. Challenges both for the person with lived experience and also for family and friends that are connected as well. And I think there are two really important areas that we need to consider for ourselves. And they are very much around, if we're interested in this area, if we know people who are living with mental ill health, or if it's been my own experience, I think what's really significant is, how do I as an individual then view a person? How do I see them? How do I see someone that might be experiencing mental ill health? And this is largely informed by, what is my theology? What is my understanding of God? Who is, or what place does God have within my life? The other very significant area is how I view, understand, see mental ill health. And I'm going to ask you, why do you think these two areas are so important? If anyone wants to speak and answer, I'm prepared to listen, but I cannot see any of you. So take a moment to think, and then if you feel like saying a reason why you think they're important, please feel free to do so. Okay, I'm happy to move on. These two areas are just so important for the simple fact that we need to be grounded within them, within ourselves, because they will inform very much how I am, how I relate to the person who may be having the lived experience. And you can say, well, that means anybody, everywhere. And that's very true. However, this has an added dimension when speaking with someone or in relationship with someone who has experiencing any form of mental ill health, because it will impact upon what relationship or connection that I can establish between the two of us. And very much from, if we look at the theological aspect of that, and I'm not going to go into this deeply, I'm going to go through this rather quickly. Okay, I forgot to use that slide, but why they're important, because they will inform us. But I think when we look at the theological aspect of how I view the individual person, it's very much about acknowledging the dignity of every person. If we look at the Charter of Human Rights, it speaks of the principle of human dignity is one of the core principles for all ethics and all major world religions. And for us, from a faith perspective, it very much comes from this quote from Genesis. God, and so God made man in his own image and likeness. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And I think this text from Genesis, from this faith perspective, it touches the very heart of how we are invited to view each person. That whole sense of dignity has nothing to do with what someone has been able to achieve, what they have accomplished, but it is simply based on the truth that this person is made in the image and likeness of God. And whenever I reflect on this quote particularly, I'm always remember, I'll call him Adam for the want of a better name. I was with Adam one day in a group, and it was a little bit chaotic. There was a lot of talking and stuff going on. But in the middle of all this, Adam leant over to me and said, "Hey, do you know, Ros, if I wasn't made in the image and likeness, I don't know what I'd be like." Adam was a young man that had spent many years in a psych hospital. But I think that, for me, seemed to speak volumes of how aware he was of something of the spirit within himself and his preparedness to acknowledge, boy, if I wasn't made in the image and likeness of God, I don't know what I'd be like. However, so often people who are experiencing mental health challenges, they actually struggle to hold on to their own sense of identity, and yet even more so, they struggle to have others acknowledge it. And again, I refer to another Adam, who in one, this is a different character, but I just used the same name. But he was speaking to me not that long back. And he was saying how he struggled in the community for people to actually recognize that he was a person of dignity. and who was inclined to say, I can respect their dignity, I can give them dignity, but they don't seem to offer the same to me. He was extremely puzzled by this. And yet it's something that many people who are living with mental ill health face quite regularly. Another area is the person is often confronted by many times well-meaning individuals that are inclined to constantly offer suggestions and advice. And at times that absolutely might be needed. Yet I wonder why we're so often so ready to do this when someone may be living with some form of mental ill health. No wonder. Do we simply presume the person to be incompetent? As a young woman I was with when we were out somewhere to get a cup of coffee, and just in a food court area, we both went up to the counter to order, and she ordered what she wanted, and the woman serving her simply said to me, does she have the money to pay for that? My response was, ask her. Did that person just simply assume that she was incompetent? Another person with the lived experience says, once you have been diagnosed with any form of mental illness, you never walk with the same dignity again. And this isn't because the person has lost it. I believe that there are sections in our society that absolutely just do not acknowledge it. From here, I would like to begin to look at how we might view that whole area of mental health and mental ill health. And I'd like to look at it insofar as we spoke about the whole story. Now, no way am I going tonight to give you the whole story in an hour and a half. But I think we can begin to read the story. And if we are focusing on the whole story of mental health and the experience of mental ill health, I believe we need to consider three important areas to gain a fuller understanding of the whole story. These areas, from my perspective, are very much needing to be intertwined. They're not an either or, they're more a both and. And if we move to what those chapters are, we can read one chapter, and that can be the clinical experience for the person with mental ill health challenges. We can also look at the social experience for them, and we can look at the lived spiritual experience. And I probably will focus on that last one a little bit more. So we move into the whole area of the clinical experience. And that's mental ill health is very much looked at from a medical clinical model, focusing on pathology, symptoms, on brain and behavior, and often seems to indicate, if you look at the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostical Statistical Manual, which is really good for the psychiatrist. It will indicate that mental illness is often seen as the person being out of touch with reality and hallucinations and delusions. And yet I'm inclined to wonder, whose reality are they out of touch with? Because my experience is they're often very much in touch with their own reality that might be very different from mine and at times from the world around them. But if we look at it from this clinical perspective, it speaks of mental ill health as a brain disease. It exhibits symptoms of a brain disease, symptoms which include impairment in thinking, delusions, hallucinations, changes in emotions, and changes in behavior. And like cancer, probably has more than one cause. That's very much summing up the clinical view from one person, but it's quite typical. And that's a valid view. However, if for us as part of a church community, faith community, being involved with people who are living with mental ill health experiences, if that's the only view that I hold, that's going to impact on a few things. It's going to impact upon how I see this person. Do I look at them as a brain disease? Person's more than that, so how? It will also impact upon how the person begins to see themselves, and that can really impact on their sense of identity. If that's the only view that the person has of their experience, they can often take on an identity of a mentally ill person. And again, to flesh that out a bit, being with somebody one time, and she had been in hospital, but she'd been living in the community for a long time. And again, I was out with another cup of coffee here, was out, different person though, out with her having a cup of coffee, and we're walking up the street to the shop, and we were stopped at some lights, and she began to exhibit some behavior that wasn't great. And I just simply said something to her that we'll call her Marjorie. I just sort of said, and I'd known her for years, so it was okay. Sort of said to her, Marjorie, look, you know, maybe here's not quite the place for that. And she looked at me with all earnestness and said, look, what do you expect from me? I'm a mental health patient. And yet she hadn't been in hospital for a long time. That seemed to form part of her identity, which isn't her identity. So I think we need to be aware of that too. And the other area is, if that's the only view, how then do I approach and connect with this person? To give you a little understanding of that, how it can impact upon people, the following quote that I'm using is for John Madrow. John is actually a psychiatrist who has also had several bouts of mental ill health and been hospitalized. But he speaks of the clinical model by saying, I cannot think of anything more destructive on one's sense of worth as a human being than to believe that the inner core of one's being is sick, that one's thoughts, values, and feelings and beliefs are merely the meaningless symptoms of a sick mind. What that concept of mental illness offered me was scientific proof that I was utterly worthless and would always be worthless. It was just the nature of my genes, chemistry, and brain process, something that I could do nothing about. Again, if that's the only chapter in a person's life, I feel it's quite sad, but it also doesn't offer much sense of hope, of moving towards a sense of well-being within that. And while I acknowledge that medicine and psychiatry are extremely important chapters, we need to continue to remember they're not the whole story for the person. The next chapter. And again, this whole area of mental ill health is an experience that impacts on everybody. Family, friends, our society, and more so on the person who is living with the challenges that are part of the person's lived experience. Their social experiences, which are often open to various forms of interpretation, abuse, and manipulation. There are huge cultural issues in this, gender issues, impact on the family, the person, and friends. And I think more importantly, that whole area of stigma that people seem to carry with them. However, we'll move to chapter 3. And this is probably the area that I will hopefully spend the most of the time on this evening, because it invites us to begin to look at mental ill health and its challenges from another perspective. Could this experience for the person be a crisis of personal meaning in their life? A profound crisis of personal meaning that is often known as mental ill health. However, this profound crisis of personal meaning is often marked by psychosis, mood disorder, dementia, trauma. It contains a loss for the person of their sense of place and belonging in the world, their connectedness with others, and at times connectedness to themselves. Old purposes and meaning no longer exists, and it raises huge questions of identity, self-worth, values, purpose, and direction in life. And again, these are deeply spiritual questions for they touch the very core of our humanity. And yes, they are questions that we all seek to answer at times. However, these questions take on a more profound meaning and urgency for a person who, with the lived experience of mental ill health. And I always find it quite interesting when you reflect on the whole words of psychiatry and psychology in particular, but the sense of their going back into their ancient root. That whole area of psyche is about, the soul or the spirit. And I sometimes wonder whether somewhere in history we lost what the meaning of these areas were. For this crisis of personal meaning could be for the person a meaningful disturbance that has to be understood before you can change or before it can go away. And it also could be holding an element of an unsuccessful attempt for a person to find a way out of what might be for them an intolerable situation. And that traumatic situation or intolerable situation might vary vastly. I was having supervision with somebody the other day, and one of her questions to me was around, can trauma trigger some forms of mental illness? And the answer is yes. An intolerable situation. But I think another factor in this whole mental health area is we need to look at the individuals. And I think they often speak of a predisposition. And they may speak it's biological or whatever, but I actually feel there's another factor. I feel people that have experienced or are experiencing mental ill health are often extremely sensitive people. That being the case, which I'm quite sure of, I remember some of us have listened to John Swinton on a webinar recently, but I remember hearing him speak at something else once, and one young chap, when he was speaking about sensitivity, one young chap stood up and said, maybe it's not us schizophrenics that are too sensitive. Maybe the world's just not sensitive enough. And I think there's truth in that too. But an intolerable situation, we look at onset of many mental illnesses are around that 18 to 25 mark, when individuals are having to make significant decisions about their life. For some, just the stress of passing their final exams could be an intolerable situation. For somebody else, it might be some horrific abuse. An unsuccessful attempt to find a way out of an intolerable situation. That does bring about this crisis of personal meaning And again, that whole sense of the word crisis meaning a dangerous opportunity, and it is. For this is really an existential crisis. And these questions have been running around for the last century in the whole area of mental health. The huge question after someone's had an onset of some form of mental ill health of who am I? Who am I now? Why did this happen to me? And why am I in this world? What is going to happen to me and my friends? How can I save the situation? And how can I atone for my mistakes? And I think the really big one here is, why has God abandoned me? So in many ways, this crisis of personal meaning is a form of an identity crisis, where there are drastic changes to the meaning system of the person's life. And again, I think this is part of a spiritual quest, as the person seeks to give their own answers to the ultimate questions of life, the meaning of personhood, and the search for identity and integrity. If any of you are familiar with clinical pastoral education, the founder of that was a man named Anton Boysen, who also was a psychologist and had 3 significant experiences of mental ill health. And he wonders whether some forms of mental illness are the person's attempt to resolve a soul problem. And another psychologist. He speaks of, just as symptoms like fever and cough are not diseases, but rather the body's attempt to fight an infection, so too psychiatric symptoms like anxiety and depression are not themselves diseases, but rather the soul's attempt to resolve an inner conflict by forcing us to pay attention to the unconscious. And if we just take those 2 quotes alone, there's lots more I could use, but just those 2 quotes alone on that sense of a problem of the soul and the soul's attempt to resolve an inner conflict. What does that invite us to, even as church and as individuals within the church? How can I, or can we, be with a person that might be struggling to resolve a soul problem? And again, at the heart of every human being is a spiritual experience which may be challenged or dislocated in the face of many any form of mental ill health. For us as church, as individuals that might be involved in this area, or as family members or as friends, I think that offers us a challenge. And that challenge is to recognize this dimension in the person's life in order that the person can be supported in their search for meaning, purpose, faith, and hope, and be enabled to recognize the wholeness of life which is within them, even within the context of any form of mental ill health. And I think we also need to be aware that for many people, this may be an enduring experience that they have in their life. There may be significant episodes, but there may also be living well in the community and still meeting some of these challenges. I think in this whole area, there is no cure. And I don't say that to be pessimistic. There's not. However, again, anxiety, depression, if someone's really depressed, you can't really work with them to an extent. And this is where I think the clinical can intertwine. Sometimes they might need medication to move them out of the depression, to begin to work on the inner conflict. Same with anxiety. But I think the focus is on, even within the face of mental health challenges, for the person to be able to live well, even within that context. You know, of knowing somebody who a couple of years ago wasn't doing much except staying in bed all day. And now she's actively involved in the community. She still has her mental health challenges, and she's living life to the full. How can we be part of that? And I think one important part is to listen to the person's story. For meaning is always in the story of the person's life, whether they are aware of it, if they are aware of it or not, it is there. And listen for the areas around meaning and purpose, connection, relationship, to give and receive love, and for the person to encounter hope. I think if you remember back at the John Madrow slide of his experience of the clinical did not offer him much hope for the future. And our hope isn't so much around the sense of, well, you will really be well in a little while, or cheer up, things will get better. Or as one person said to me when someone said that to her, she said, I cheered up, Ros, and things didn't get better. But the hope is very much about things can change. It can be better than how it is now. Listen to their story. And I'm inclined to say, listen, listen, and listen again to the person's story. And sometimes it's not about asking questions. remember one person saying to me a good while back, she said to me, you know, Ros, I love talking to you. And I thought, oh, this is nice. I'm doing something well. And then she went on to say, because you don't ask me any questions. People who are living with mental ill health challenges are often faced, particularly in the clinical model, of being asked question after question. It's just coming alongside the person as person. And our whole basis of that, I mean, if we speak about meaning and purpose, relationship and hope, I think we're also very much speaking about a sense of spirituality, because that's seeking ultimate meaning that's mediated through these areas. You know, I know there's a little music group going on in the parish at the moment, or singing group. Sometimes that might be the area for the person. And I'm sure it's good for anyone's mental health today with all our lockdowns that we've been through and the way the whole world is. Somebody else, it might be nature, relationship, and worship. But the person who's got this lived experience of mental ill health is seeking ultimate meaning in their life also. I'm going to move into the last little bit because I think it's how do we look at it and how do we see our place in it? I want to reflect upon the Paschal mystery, the Easter story. It's something we all know and we all know well. But this quote from Sheila Cassidy that had nothing to do with mental illness, it's actually on dying. She worked in palliative care. But she writes, at the religious level, perhaps the most important gift is a sort of Paschal overview. The ability to hold in the same focus the harsh reality of suffering and the mind-boggling truth of resurrection, of life after death. For us in this area to hold in the same focus the harsh reality of mental ill health and its challenges, and the mind-boggling truth of hope that life can be different, it can be better than what it is now. If we look at that area of the Easter story or the Paschal overview, we look at Good Friday and we look at the disciples and friends of Jesus. They had a dream of what their life might be like with Jesus. There was possibly a promise and hopes, and all of these were dashed. For Jesus had died, he was buried, and it's now a time to grieve. For me, there are parallels in this with the experience of mental ill health for the person. The dreams of the person may have gone. I was studying to do medicine and look at me now. I had hoped by now I would be married and have a family, but that dream's also gone. At the onset of mental ill health, there can also be that sense of the death of hope for the future. And the person then often withdraws and needs a time to grieve. If you visit any psych ward at any time, you will probably see many people lying about. I think that comes about around that whole sense of grieving and aware of a loss. But also, Karl Rahner wrote of his experience in a psych ward once, of going in and seeing a lot of people. In those days, there were beanbags, lying on beanbags, seemingly if nothing was happening. And he questioned that, as I do too, that sense of why the person may be withdrawn. They may need to be withdrawn to cope with their own grief, their own fear, their own loss. And it is for all a very turbulent time. And then we have Holy Saturday. And if we look at scripture, we don't hear anything about Holy Saturday. It's silent. It's an in-between time where people may have been feeling lost, of wondering what was happening, what's going to happen next. The community was silent and is grieving. Holy Saturday is the in-between time. And I believe this is the space where we often encounter the person living with mental ill health and their lived experience. Encounter the person with the lived experience, father, mother, brother, sister, neighbor, between the turbulent time of hope and resurrection. It's almost like a little bit of a nothingness time. And this time can be weeks, months, or years. What often emerges here is grief. And this can take many forms, anger being one of the main ones, exhaustion, withdrawal. And I feel often we tend to fail to recognize that the behavior we see is more about grief than anything else. I'm not sure as a society we actually attend to grief well. But if we know somebody, family member, friend, or we're working in this area, there may be that need to acknowledge that this person is grieving and there's somewhere in the between a turbulent time and hope of resurrection. We could ask how to name and attend to grief. And perhaps we don't need to name it More importantly, the need to recognize the grief and listen, 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 and be present to the person in hope. And we merge to Easter Sunday. What was dead is alive again in an utterly imaginable way, alive yet different. I think it's very much the same in the mental health area. Now, I've often spoken to parents and family members, and often they say, oh, look, I just wish we could have him or her back how they used to be. That's never going to be a possibility. I can't go back to who I was yesterday. It's about the person who's gone through this experience. They may be alive again and yet different. And it's acceptance of that. I can think of one person that's been through it, and it's actually become part of her mission in life now is to work in this area and for the rights of people who have experienced mental ill health. I've been going for nearly an hour, but I want to finish with one little bit of words of wisdom. Taken from Winnie the Pooh. And I read this recently, and it struck me how much Eeyore might be typifying many people in our society today with COVID, that sense of flatness, anxiety, and depression. So I'd like to read you this. It occurred to Pooh and Piglet they hadn't heard from Eeyore for several days. So they put on their hats and coats and trotted across the 100-acre wood to Eeyore's stick house. Inside the house was Eeyore. Hello, Eeyore, said Pooh. Hello, Pooh. Hello, Piglet, said Eeyore in a glum-sounding voice. We just thought we'd check in on you, said Piglet, because we hadn't heard from you. So we wanted to know if you are okay. Eeyore was silent for a moment. Am I okay? He asked eventually. Well, I don't know, to be honest. Are any of us okay? That's what I ask myself. And I can tell you, Pooh and Piglet, is that right now I feel rather sad and alone and not much fun to be around at all, which is why I haven't bothered you. Because you wouldn't want to waste your time hanging out with someone who is sad and alone and not much fun to be around at all, would you now? Pooh looked at Piglet and Piglet looked at Pooh, and they both sat down on either side of Eeyore in his stick house. Eeyore looked at them in surprise. What are you doing? We're sitting here with you, said Pooh, because we are your friends. And true friends don't care if someone is feeling sad or alone or not much fun to be around at all. True friends are there for you anyway, and so we are here. Oh, said Eeyore. Oh. And the three of them sat there in silence, and while Pooh and Piglet said nothing at all, somehow almost imperceptibly, Eeyore started to feel a little bit better because Pooh and Piglet were there. No more, no less. Okay. What I want to do now is to break you into breakout groups. They will be random, and I think Jacinta has to do that because or maybe I can too, for about 15 minutes.